December 16, 2009. The city of Cuernavaca, known as the City of Eternal Spring, is about to become the epicenter of a storm of fire and lead. Inside a luxury apartment complex, a man is cornered. He is not just any man. He is the jefe de jefes, the boss of bosses, El Barbas, the leader of one of the most powerful and ruthless drug trafficking organizations in Mexico. His name is Arturo Beltrán Leyva. The air crackles with tension as elite units of the Mexican Navy approach, their weapons trained on the building that has transformed into a fortress. For hours, the night will be shattered by the relentless staccato of automatic weapons, the deafening roar of grenades, and the desperate screams of men locked in a struggle of life or death. This is not just an arrest operation. It is a battle for control. A bloody climax in the brutal war on drugs. Was this man a product of his environment, a victim of a system that offered few paths to power? Or was he a monster, a cold-blooded predator who unleashed untold suffering in his quest for wealth and dominance? Was he a brilliant strategist and a charismatic leader who commanded unwavering loyalty, or a paranoid tyrant whose own actions would inevitably lead to his doom? How did a man from the rugged mountains of Sinaloa rise to become one of the most feared and wanted criminals in the world, only to die in a hail of bullets, his body desecrated and displayed like a grotesque trophy? Join me as we delve into the dark and violent world of Arturo Beltrán Leyva. A story of power, betrayal, and blood. A story that reveals the complex and often contradictory nature of a man who was both a king and a pawn in the deadly game of international drug trafficking. If you are passionate about the stories that power tried to hide, subscribe. What comes next is even darker. The story of Arturo Beltrán Leyva does not begin in the luxury apartment where it would end violently, but in the rugged, sun-drenched landscape of rural Sinaloa, Mexico. He was born on September 27, 1961, in the small town of Tameapa, in the municipality of Badiraguato. This region, known as the Golden Triangle, for its prolific production of opium and marijuana, has been the cradle of many of Mexico's most notorious drug traffickers. It is a land of stark contrasts, of breathtaking natural beauty and crushing poverty, of deeply rooted family loyalties, and a culture of violence where the law of the gun often supplants the law of the state. Arturo was the eldest of the Beltrán Leyva brothers, a clan that would one day lend its name to a fearsome criminal empire. He was followed by Carlos, Alfredo, and Hector. From a young age, the brothers were immersed in a world where illegality was a means of survival, a path to a life beyond the limitations of their impoverished surroundings. Their family, like many in the region, had ties to the illicit drug trade, a business that had been woven into the very fabric of the local economy for generations. The Beltrán Leyva brothers were not alone in this world. They grew up alongside other young men who would become major figures in Mexican drug trafficking, including Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán. The bonds forged in these early years, in the shared experiences of poverty and ambition, would shape the future of drug trafficking in Mexico for decades. It was said that Arturo, even in his youth, possessed a natural charisma and a sharp intellect. He was ambitious and impulsive, with a deep understanding of the violent calculus of power in the world he inhabited. He learned early on that respect was not earned with words, but with actions, and that fear was a more reliable currency than friendship. As he came of age, he began to make a name for himself as an astute and ruthless operator, a man who feared no violence to achieve his goals. He started, like many, at the bottom of the criminal ladder, working as a bodyguard and hitman for local traffickers. But it was clear to everyone who knew him that Arturo was destined for greater things. He was a born leader with a magnetic personality that drew people to him, and a cold-blooded pragmatism that allowed him to make the hard decisions necessary to rise through the ranks of the underworld. The mountains of Sinaloa were his school, and the lessons he learned there would serve him well in the years to come as he embarked on a path that would lead him from the dusty streets of his hometown to the pinnacle of a global criminal enterprise, and ultimately to his bloody demise in a luxury apartment in Cuernavaca. The seeds of his future empire and his eventual fall were all sown in the unforgiving soil of the Golden Triangle. The rise of Arturo Beltrán Leyva and his brothers from provincial thugs to architects of a global criminal enterprise is a story of strategic alliances, ruthless ambition, and the shifting dynamics of the international drug trade. In the 1980s, the Mexican drug trafficking landscape was dominated by the Guadalajara cartel, a powerful syndicate led by figures like Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, Rafael Caro Quintero, and Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo. It was within this larger organization that many of the next generation of drug lords, including Arturo Beltrán Leyva and his contemporary Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán, earned their stripes. The Beltrán Leyva brothers, with Arturo at the helm, initially carved out a niche as a security and enforcement wing. Their reputation for violence and efficiency made them valuable assets to the more established players. They were known for their ability to corrupt officials, intimidate rivals, and move product with a ruthless efficiency that caught the attention of the cartel leadership. The arrest of Félix Gallardo in 1989 and the subsequent fragmentation of the Guadalajara cartel created a power vacuum, a chaotic landscape of shifting alliances and bloody turf wars. It was in this crucible of violence that the modern Mexican drug cartels were forged. The Beltrán Leyva brothers, with their close ties to El Chapo Guzmán, became integral components of what would eventually be known as the Sinaloa cartel. Arturo, with his sharp business acumen and deep connections within law enforcement and the political elite, fit naturally into a leadership role within this new federation. He was known as El Barbas, the Beard, and was widely respected for his ability to negotiate deals, launder money, and orchestrate the complex logistics of moving tons of cocaine from South America to the United States. While El Chapo was the public face of the Sinaloa cartel, a mythical figure who captured the public imagination, Arturo Beltrán Leyva was the quiet power behind the throne, the master strategist who ensured the wheels of the organization kept turning. The Beltrán Leyva organization, operating under the broader umbrella of the Sinaloa cartel, became a formidable force in its own right. They controlled key smuggling corridors, particularly in the northern states of Sonora and Nuevo León, and established a sophisticated network of corruption that extended to the highest levels of the Mexican government. They pioneered the use of violence as a tool of psychological warfare. Their brutal tactics sent a clear message to rivals and anyone who dared stand in their way. Arturo, in particular, was known for his ostentatious lifestyle, his love for lavish parties, expensive cars, and beautiful women. He was a grandiose figure who reveled in his power and wealth, a modern gangster who seemed to have stepped straight out of a Hollywood movie. But beneath the veneer of glamour and excess lay a cold and calculating mind. A man who would stop at nothing to protect his empire and expand his influence. The rise of the Beltrán Leyva brothers was a testament to their ability to adapt and thrive in the ever-evolving world of organized crime. They were masters of a deadly game, and, for a time, it seemed their power was limitless, their reign impregnable. But in the treacherous world of drug trafficking, alliances are fleeting, and the throne is always coveted by those willing to kill for it. The very foundation of their empire, their close bond with El Chapo Guzman, would eventually become the source of their undoing. A testament to the old adage that in the world of crime, there is no honor among thieves. The partnership between the Beltrán Leyva brothers and Joaquín El Chapo Guzman was, for many years, the cornerstone of the Sinaloa cartel's dominance. It was a symbiotic relationship, a fusion of complementary skills and shared ambition. While El Chapo was the visionary, the public face of the organization, a master of logistics, and a folk hero to some, Arturo Beltrán Leyva was the enforcer, the strategist, the man who ensured the smooth operation of the cartel's vast and complex machinery. He was the boss of bosses, a title that reflected his authority and the respect he commanded not only within his own organization, but also among his rivals. The Beltrán Leyva organization, known as La Oficina, the office, was responsible for some of the Sinaloa cartel's most critical functions. They managed the cartel security, carrying out assassinations, kidnappings, and acts of intimidation against enemies. They were also masters of corruption, with an uncanny ability to infiltrate law enforcement agencies and government institutions at local, state, and federal levels. It was said that Arturo in particular had a vast network of contacts within the Mexican government, a shadow state that provided him with intelligence, protection, and impunity. This network allowed the Sinaloa cartel to operate with a degree of freedom that was the envy of its rivals. They could move drugs, launder money, and eliminate their enemies with little fear of reprisal. The Beltrán Leyva brothers also played a key role in the cartel's expansion into new territories, both within Mexico and abroad. They established lucrative smuggling routes through Central America and forged alliances with Colombian cocaine suppliers, ensuring a steady flow of product for the insatiable American market. Arturo's brother, Alfredo Beltrán Leyva, known as El Mochomo, was a key figure in these operations, responsible for overseeing the transport of multi-ton cocaine shipments. The relationship between Arturo and El Chapo was more than just a business partnership. It was a bond forged in the crucible of their shared origins in the mountains of Sinaloa. They were said to be close friends, their families intertwined by marriage and shared social circles. But in the high-stakes world of drug trafficking, where fortunes are made and lost overnight, and where betrayal is a constant threat, even the strongest ties can break. The seeds of distrust were sown in the early 2000s as the Sinaloa cartel's power grew and the stakes became higher. The immense profits generated by drug trafficking created a climate of intense competition and paranoia. El Chapo's arrest in Guatemala in 1993 and his subsequent escape from a high-security prison in 2001 had only enhanced his mythical status, but it also created a power vacuum that others were eager to fill. Arturo Beltrán Leyva, with his own considerable power and influence, was seen by some as a potential rival for El Chapo's leadership. The dynamics between the two men became increasingly complex, a delicate balance of cooperation and competition. They were allies, but they were also rivals. Their fates intertwined in a dangerous dance of power and ambition. The golden age of their partnership was about to come to a dramatic and bloody end. An end that would not only tear the Sinaloa cartel apart, but also plunge Mexico into a new and even more terrifying cycle of violence. The catalyst for this rupture would be an act of betrayal. A betrayal so profound that it would turn brother against brother and ignite a war that would leave a trail of death and destruction in its wake. The fragile alliance that had held the Sinaloa cartel together for years finally shattered on January 21, 2008. On that day, the Mexican Federal Police, acting on a tip, arrested Arturo Beltrán Leyva, El Mochomo, in the city of Culiacán, the heart of the cartel's territory. Alfredo, the youngest of the Beltrán Leyva brothers, was a key logistical operator responsible for managing the transport of vast quantities of cocaine and laundering drug proceeds. His capture was a major blow to the organization, a crippling decapitation strike that sent shockwaves through the underworld. For Arturo Beltrán Leyva, his brother's arrest was not just a strategic setback. It was a deeply personal betrayal. He was convinced that El Chapo Guzman had handed his brother over to the authorities. A suspicion fueled by the fact that the arrest had been carried out with a level of precision and intelligence suggesting an inside source. The motive for such treachery, in Arturo's eyes, was clear. El Chapo, always the pragmatist, might have sacrificed Alfredo to protect his own son, Ivan Arquivaldo Guzman Salazar, who was also facing legal troubles at the time. Whether this suspicion was based on fact or paranoia is a matter of debate. But for Arturo, it was an unforgivable act of treason. The bond of trust that had once united the two men was irrevocably broken. In the narco world, where loyalty is the most precious commodity, betrayal is a sin that can only be washed away with blood. Arturo Beltrán Leyva, blinded by rage and a thirst for revenge, declared war on his former friend and partner. The Beltrán Leyva organization, once an integral part of the Sinaloa cartel, broke away, taking with it its vast network of assassins, corrupt officials, and smuggling routes. This was not simply a business dispute. It was a divorce written in blood. A family feud that would become one of the most brutal conflicts in the history of the Mexican drug war. The newly created Beltrán Leyva Cartel, under Arturo's leadership, immediately went on the offensive. They allied themselves with their former enemies, the Juárez Cartel, and their armed wing, Los Zetas, a notoriously violent group of former Special Forces soldiers. This new alliance, known as the Federation, was a formidable force united by a common enemy, El Chapo Guzman and the remnants of the Sinaloa cartel. The war that followed was unlike anything Mexico had seen before. It was a war fought not in the shadows, but out in the open. On the streets of cities and towns across the country, car bombs, a tactic once limited to conflict zones in the Middle East, became a terrifying new feature of the Mexican drug war. Public displays of violence, such as beheadings and mass killings, were used to sow terror and intimidate rivals. The violence was indiscriminate, with civilians often caught in the crossfire. The rupture between Arturo Beltrán Leyva and El Chapo Guzman had unleashed a plague of violence that would consume Mexico for years. The old codes of conduct, the unwritten rules that had once governed the drug trade, were abandoned in the pursuit of vengeance. The war was personal, and for Arturo Beltrán Leyva, it was a fight to the death. His quest for revenge would put him on a collision course with the full power of the Mexican state, a path that would lead him to his final and bloody confrontation in a luxury apartment in Cuernavaca. The betrayal had not only destroyed a criminal empire, it had also sealed his fate. Arturo Beltrán Leyva's declaration of war against his former allies plunged Mexico into a maelstrom of violence. The newly christened Beltrán Leyva Cartel, fueled by a potent cocktail of rage and ambition, embarked on a campaign of terror that redrew the map of the Mexican underworld. Arturo, now the undisputed leader of his own organization, proved to be a formidable and ruthless warlord. He leveraged his extensive network of corrupt officials, a web he had spent years cultivating, to gain an advantage over his enemies. High-ranking law enforcement officers, intelligence agents, and even a drug czar were on his payroll, providing him with a steady stream of information on his rivals' movements and the government operations supposedly hunting him. This intelligence advantage allowed him to strike with surgical precision, eliminating his enemies before they even knew they were in his sights. One of the first and most shocking acts of retribution came just months after Alfredo's arrest. On May 8, 2008, Edgar Guzman Lopez, the 22-year-old son of El Chapo Guzman, was gunned down in the parking lot of a shopping center in Culiacan. The murder was a clear message to El Chapo. No one was safe, not even his own family. The killing of a narco's son was a violation of a long-standing unwritten rule in drug trafficking. A rule that, for the most part, had prevented violence from spilling over into the personal lives of cartel leaders. Arturo Beltrán Leyva had crossed a line, and in doing so, he had escalated the conflict to a terrifying new level. The war between the Beltrán Leyva Cartel and the Sinaloa Cartel was fought on multiple fronts. In the northern state of Chihuahua, the Beltrán Leyvas allied with the Juárez Cartel to challenge Sinaloa's control over the lucrative smuggling corridor into El Paso, Texas. This battle for control of Ciudad Juárez, one of the most violent cities in the world, would claim thousands of lives. In the states of Guerrero and Morelos, the Beltrán Leyva Cartel established a new stronghold, terrorizing the local population and turning the once thriving resort city of Acapulco into a ghost town. Arturo's reign of terror was not limited to his rivals in the drug trade. He also targeted high-ranking government officials who dared to stand in his way. In a bold display of power, his hitmen assassinated the acting chief of the Mexican Federal Police, a man who had been instrumental in the fight against the Beltrán Leyva organization. The message was clear. No one was out of reach. The violence wasn't just strategic, it was performative. Arturo Beltrán Leyva understood the power of fear, the importance of psychological warfare. His assassins often left gruesome messages at the scenes of their crimes, the bodies of their victims dismembered and displayed in public places. This campaign of terror was designed to intimidate his enemies, sow chaos and instability, and demonstrate the absolute power of the Beltrán Leyva Cartel. For a brief but bloody period, it seemed that Arturo Beltrán Leyva was invincible. He was the new king, a man who had challenged the most powerful drug trafficker in the world and lived to tell the tale. He was wealthy, he was feared, and seemingly untouchable. But the very qualities that had propelled him to the top of the underworld, his ruthlessness, his paranoia, his insatiable appetite for power, would also be the seeds of his destruction. The war he had started had not only made him a target for his rivals, it had also made him a priority for the Mexican government, a government under increasing pressure from the United States to show results in the drug war. Time was running out for the boss of bosses. His bloody reign was about to end, not in a blaze of glory, but in a desperate last stand against forces closing in on him from all sides. As Arturo Beltrán Leyva's war against El Chapo Guzman intensified, his methods became increasingly brutal and his targets more audacious. The conflict was not merely a turf war for smuggling routes. It was a personal vendetta, a campaign of extermination directed at anyone associated with his former partner. The Beltrán Leyva Cartel, now allied with the hyper-violent Los Zetas, adopted the shock and awe tactics of their rivals, resorting to public displays of brutality to terrorize both their enemies and the civilian population. Decapitations, a gruesome tactic previously foreign to Mexican cartel violence, became a grim signature of the Beltrán Leyva organization. Severed heads of traffickers, rivals, and police officers were left in public spaces, outside government buildings, in town squares, on the side of highways, often accompanied by handwritten messages or narcomantas, narco banners, threatening more bloodshed. These grotesque displays were a form of psychological warfare designed to project an image of absolute power and to demonstrate that no one was beyond their reach. One of the highest profile targets in this campaign of terror was the Mexican Federal Police itself. Arturo Beltrán Leyva had long prided himself on his ability to corrupt law enforcement, but he was equally ruthless in punishing those who refused to be bought. In May 2008, just a day after the murder of El Chapo's son, Beltrán Leyva hitmen assassinated Edgar Eusebio Milan Gomez, the acting chief of the Mexican Federal Police. Milan Gomez was a key figure in the government's fight against the cartels, and his murder, carried out in his own home, was a brazen act of defiance, a clear message to the Mexican state that the Beltrán Leyva cartel did not fear confronting the full power of the government. The war also extended to the highest echelons of the Mexican government's security apparatus. In late 2008, a massive corruption scandal dubbed Operation Cleanliness, Operación Limpieza, exposed the extent of the Beltrán Leyva cartel's influence within the Federal Attorney General's office. High-ranking officials, including former drug czar Noé Ramírez Manduyano, were arrested and accused of leaking sensitive information to the cartel in exchange for millions of dollars in bribes. The scandal was a stunning illustration of Arturo's ability to penetrate and corrupt the very institutions supposed to be fighting him. It also highlighted the immense challenge facing the Mexican government in its war on drugs, a war where the enemy was often inside the gates. The violence was not limited to high-profile targets. In the states of Guerrero and Morelos, where the Beltrán Leyva cartel had established a new power base, a wave of kidnappings, extortions, and murders terrorized the local population. The once glamorous resort of Acapulco became a battlefield, its streets littered with bodies, its businesses shuttered. Arturo Beltrán Leyva, in his quest for vengeance and dominance, had unleashed a storm of violence that was consuming entire regions of the country. But this relentless campaign of terror came at a cost. The high-profile assassinations and brazen corruption scandals had made Arturo Beltrán Leyva public enemy number one. The Mexican government, with full backing from the United States, was now determined to take him down. The noose was tightening. The circle of corrupt officials he could trust was shrinking, and the number of enemies who wanted him dead grew by the day. His paranoia, a quality that had once served him well in the treacherous world of drug trafficking, was now consuming him. He saw betrayal around every corner, and his loyalty, once unwavering toward his subordinates, began to erode. The king was becoming a tyrant, his kingdom an empire of fear. The stage was being set for the final act of his tragic and violent life, a final confrontation where the hunter would become the hunted. By 2009, Arturo Beltrán Leyva was one of the most wanted men in the world. The Mexican government, with significant intelligence and logistical support from the United States Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, had made his capture or elimination a top priority. The boss of bosses was no longer just a drug trafficker. He was a national security threat, a man who had openly declared war on the state and demonstrated his ability to corrupt it from within. The hunt for Arturo Beltrán Leyva was a high-stakes game of cat and mouse, a desperate pursuit of a ghost moving through a clandestine world of safe houses, secret tunnels, and corrupt officials. He was a master of evasion, constantly changing his location, his communication methods, and his inner circle. He trusted no one, and for good reason. The reward for his capture was millions of dollars, tempting prize for anyone in his organization who might be willing to betray him. The key to finding him lay in penetrating his inner circle, in turning one of his own against him. The Mexican Navy's Special Forces, or highly trained elite unit, were tasked with leading the hunt. Unlike the federal police, which had been deeply compromised by cartel corruption, the Navy, La Marina, was viewed as a more reliable and incorruptible force. They began systematically dismantling the Beltrán Leyva Cartel's operations, arresting key lieutenants, seizing drug shipments, and gathering intelligence that would bring them closer to their ultimate target. The breakthrough came in December 2009. Through a combination of electronic surveillance and human intelligence, Mexican authorities were able to pinpoint Arturo's location in the city of Cuernavaca, a popular weekend destination for Mexico City's wealthy elite. He was hiding in a luxury apartment complex called Altitude, a modern high-rise building he had turned into a veritable fortress. On the night of December 11th, the Navy launched a raid on a lavish Christmas party Arturo was hosting in the nearby town of Ahuatepec. The raid was chaotic and bloody. Several of Arturo's gunmen were killed, and various prostitutes and musicians, including the famous norteño singer Ramón Ayala, were detained. But Arturo himself managed to escape, slipping through the net in the confusion of the raid. It was a narrow escape, a testament to his uncanny ability to stay one step ahead of the law. But it was also a sign that his luck was running out. The noose was tightening, and he knew it. The failed raid had exposed his location, and it was only a matter of time before they came for him again. He retreated to his safe house in the Altitude apartment complex, surrounded by his most loyal bodyguards, and prepared for the final showdown. He was cornered, but he was not going to be taken alive. He was a man who had lived by the gun, and he was determined to die by the gun. The stage was set for a battle that would not only mark the end of his life, but would also symbolize the brutal and bloody nature of the war he had helped create. The city of Eternal Spring was about to become a war zone. The final hours of Arturo Beltrán Leyva's life unfolded with the brutal intensity of a Hollywood action movie. Following his narrow escape from the Christmas party raid, he retreated to his last bastion of safety, a third-floor apartment in the Altitude Tower in Cuernavaca. He was not alone. With him were several of his most trusted sicarios, hitmen, a Praetorian guard willing to die for their boss. They were heavily armed, ready for a siege, and fully aware that this would likely be their last stand. The Mexican Navy, stung by the near miss at the party, was determined not to let him slip away again. They had a wealth of intelligence, provided in part by the DEA, which had been tracking Beltrán Leyva's movements. They knew which apartment he was in, and they knew he was not going to surrender peacefully. On the afternoon of December 16, 2009, the operation began. More than 200 elite Marines, supported by helicopters and armored vehicles, descended upon the upscale neighborhood. They evacuated the other residents of the altitude complex, turning the luxury residential building into a vertical battlefield. The initial assault was met with fierce resistance. As the Marines attempted to storm the apartment, they were met with a hail of automatic gunfire and grenade explosions. Beltrán Leyva and his men had fortified their position, using the apartment's layout to their advantage, creating choke points and kill zones. The battle raged for hours, the sound of combat echoing through the once quiet city. The Marines were relentless, advancing room by room, their superior training and firepower slowly tipping the scales. A helicopter hovered over the building, its gunner providing suppressive fire, shattering the apartment windows and keeping the defenders pinned down. Inside the smoke-filled apartment, the scene was one of chaos and desperation. Arturo Beltrán Leyva, the boss of bosses, was no longer a remote commander, but a front-line soldier, fighting for his life alongside his men. Accounts of his final moments are a mix of official reports and underworld legend. Some say he was on the phone trying to call for reinforcements that would never arrive. Others say he was the last one fighting, with a gun in one hand and a grenade in the other. What is known for certain is that he did not go quietly. The end came late in the night. After a prolonged and bloody firefight, the Marines finally breached the apartment's last line of defense. They found Arturo Beltrán Leyva dead, his body riddled with bullets. Beside him lay the bodies of several of his loyal bodyguards. The siege was over. One Marine had died in the assault. A grenade thrown by one of Beltrán Leyva's men had exploded in his face. The death of Arturo Beltrán Leyva was a major victory for the Mexican government, a symbolic blow against one of the country's most feared criminal organizations. The government rushed to publicize the victory, releasing photos and videos of the operation. But it was the images that emerged after the raid that would spark the greatest controversy. The body of Arturo Beltrán Leyva, pants pulled down and covered in blood-soaked peso bills, was a grotesque and macabre spectacle. It was a message, a warning to other drug lords, but it was also a symbol of the depths of depravity the drug war had reached. The king was dead, but the war was far from over. His death would create a new power vacuum, a new round of violence, and a new generation of narcos eager to take his place. The death of Arturo Beltrán Leyva, while a significant tactical victory for the Mexican government, did not end the violence. In many ways, it only exacerbated it. The decapitation of the Beltrán Leyva Cartel created a power vacuum, a void that was quickly filled by a chaotic and bloody struggle for succession. The once unified organization, held together by Arturo's charismatic and ruthless leadership, fractured into several smaller, competing factions. His brother, Héctor Beltrán Leyva, known as ALH, attempted to take control of the remnants of the organization, but he lacked Arturo's authority and ability to command loyalty. Other lieutenants, sensing an opportunity, broke away to form their own splinter groups, such as the South Pacific Cartel and the Independent Cartel of Acapulco. These new groups, often lacking the sophistication and high-level political connections of their predecessors, turned to more predatory and indiscriminate forms of violence. Kidnapping, extortion, and human trafficking became their primary sources of revenue as they preyed on the civilian population in the territories they controlled. The state of Guerrero, once a tourist paradise, descended into a state of near anarchy as these splinter groups, fought each other and security forces for control of the lucrative drug trade and local criminal networks. Violence was no longer confined to the underworld. It had become part of daily life for ordinary citizens. The death of Arturo Beltrán Leyva also had a profound impact on the broader landscape of the Mexican drug war. The Sinaloa cartel, freed from its most formidable rival, was able to consolidate its power and expand its influence into territories previously controlled by the Beltrán Leyva organization. The balance of power had shifted, but the cycle of violence continued unabated. Immediately following Arturo's death, there was a gruesome act of retribution that underscored the brutality of the conflict. Melquisedec Angulo Cordova, the Marine who had died during the raid on Arturo's apartment, was buried with full military honors, hailed as a national hero. Just hours after his funeral, gunmen stormed his family's home, killing his mother, his sister, and 2 other relatives. The massacre was a message of pure, unadulterated vengeance, a sign that even in death, the war was not over. Arturo Beltrán Leyva's legacy is complex and bloody. He was a product of a system that offered few opportunities for social mobility. A man who used violence and corruption to achieve a level of power and wealth that would have been unimaginable to him as a child in the mountains of Sinaloa. He was a brilliant strategist, a charismatic leader, and a ruthless killer. He built a criminal empire that spanned the globe and challenged the authority of the Mexican state itself. But in the end, his own paranoia and insatiable thirst for revenge led to his downfall. He was a man who lived and died by the sword, a tragic figure in a war with no heroes, only villains and victims. His death was not the end of the story, but merely the closing of a bloody chapter in the ongoing saga of the drug war in Mexico, a war that continues to claim thousands of lives and tear at the very fabric of Mexican society. The boss of bosses was gone, but the monster he had helped create lived on. The story of Arturo Beltrán Leyva is a chilling parable about power, ambition, and the corrupting influence of global drug trafficking. He was a man of contradictions, a charismatic leader who inspired fierce loyalty, and a paranoid tyrant who inspired terror. An astute businessman who built a multi-billion-dollar empire, and a ruthless murderer who left a trail of death and destruction in his wake. His life and death offer a stark and brutal illustration of the dynamics of the drug war in Mexico. A conflict that is not simply a battle between good and evil, but a complex web of shifting alliances, endemic corruption, and a seemingly endless cycle of violence. Was Arturo Beltrán Leyva an anomaly, a particularly vicious outlier in the world of organized crime? Or was he the inevitable product of a system that has allowed drug trafficking to flourish? A system fueled by the insatiable demand for illicit drugs in the United States and the widespread corruption that has hollowed out many of Mexico's key institutions. The answer, like the man himself, is complex. He was undoubtedly a man of exceptional abilities, a born leader with a sharp intellect and ruthless pragmatism. But his talents were channeled into a world of criminality, a world where the only path to success was through violence and intimidation. He was a product of the Golden Triangle, the cradle of Mexican drug trafficking, a region where for generations the illicit drug trade has offered the only viable alternative to a life of poverty and subsistence farming. His rise to power was facilitated by a culture of corruption that extends to the highest levels of the Mexican government. A culture he not only exploited, but also helped to perpetuate. His fall was as spectacular as his rise. His decision to go to war with El Chapo Guzman, a war fueled by a potent cocktail of pain and paranoia, was a strategic miscalculation that ultimately sealed his fate. It turned him from a relatively low-profile operator into a high-value target, a man who had made too many enemies and become too big and too violent to be ignored. His death in a hail of bullets in a luxury apartment in Cuernavaca was a fittingly dramatic end to a life lived on the edge. But what is Arturo Beltrán Leyva's final legacy? For the Mexican government, his death was a symbol of their resolve in the drug war, a demonstration that no one is above the law. But was it a victory? The fragmentation of his cartel led to an explosion of violence in the regions he once controlled. A violence that was often more chaotic and indiscriminate than what had existed before. For the people of Mexico, particularly those living in the areas hardest hit by the drug war, his legacy is one of fear, trauma, and a justice system that has failed to protect them. He is a ghost that still haunts the country, a reminder of the dark and destructive power of drug trafficking. His story is a warning about the corrosive effects of unchecked power and the human cost of a war that seems to have no end. Terror was his language, and corruption his Bible. Behind every fortune lies a story no one dares to tell. You already know where to find it. Subscribe for more, because the fall of the king is just as bloody as his rise. The life of Arturo Beltrán Leyva, from his humble beginnings in the mountains of Sinaloa to his violent end in Cuernavaca, is a microcosm of the greater tragedy of the Mexican drug war. It is a story that forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of good and evil, the root causes of violence, and the efficacy of current strategies used to combat organized crime. It is easy to dismiss him as a monster, a one-dimensional villain who brought nothing but suffering and death to the world. And while the immense harm he caused cannot be denied, to do so would be to ignore the complex social, economic, and political factors that create men like Arturo Beltrán Leyva. The war on drugs, as currently conceived, has been a catastrophic failure. Decades of militarization of a kingpin strategy that focuses on eliminating cartel leaders has done little to stem the flow of drugs or reduce the level of violence. If anything, it has only worsened the problem. The elimination of a leader like Arturo Beltrán Leyva simply creates a power vacuum, leading to bloody succession struggles and the fragmentation of cartels into smaller, more violent groups. This strategy fails to address the root causes of drug trafficking, the poverty and lack of opportunity that push young people into the arms of the cartels, the endemic corruption that allows them to operate with impunity, and the insatiable demand for drugs in the United States and Europe. As long as these underlying conditions persist, there will always be another Arturo Beltrán Leyva, another El Chapo, another generation of young men willing to kill and die for a chance at a life of wealth and power. The story of Arturo Beltrán Leyva is also a story about the corrosive effects of corruption, its ability to infiltrate the highest levels of the Mexican government, to buy off police chiefs, politicians, and even the country's drug czar. It is a stark reminder of the extent to which the state has been compromised by the power of drug money. This corruption not only undermines the rule of law, it also erodes public trust in the very institutions supposed to protect them. When the police are on the cartel's payroll, when justice is for sale, there can be no real security, nor real peace, and The challenge for Mexico and the international community is to move beyond the failed strategies of the past and develop a new approach to the problem of organized crime. One based on a more holistic understanding of the issue. This means addressing poverty and inequality, strengthening the rule of law, rooting out corruption, and treating drug addiction as a public health issue, not just a criminal one. It is a daunting task that will require immense political will and long-term commitment. But the alternative, continuing down the same path of violence and repression, is to condemn future generations to repeat the tragic and bloody cycle exemplified by the life and death of Arturo Beltrán Leyva. His story is a warning, and it is one we would do well to heed. Arturo Beltrán Leyva's influence extended far beyond the realm of drug trafficking and violence. He was also a master of public relations, a narco who understood the importance of cultivating a certain image, a Robin Hood-style persona in the territories he controlled. In the state of Morelos, where he fought his last battle, he was known for his generosity, his lavish parties, and his patronage of local musicians and businesses. He reportedly handed out cash to the poor, sponsored local festivals, and mediated disputes, positioning himself as a benevolent and powerful figure who could provide a level of security and social order that the state could not. This strategy, common among drug traffickers, was designed to win the loyalty of the local population, to create a network of eyes and ears that would protect him from the authorities. It was a form of social control, a way to buy silence and complicity through a mixture of fear and favor. The Christmas party where he narrowly escaped capture was a perfect example of this. It was a lavish event with expensive food and drink, and entertainment provided by some of Mexico's most famous musicians. It was a display of his wealth and power, a way to reward his followers and reinforce his status as the local godfather. But this carefully constructed image of the benevolent patron was a facade, a thin veneer hiding a much darker reality. For every act of charity, there were countless acts of brutality. For every person he helped, there were many more who were terrorized, extorted, or murdered by his organization. The peace he provided was a pax mafiosa, a peace maintained through the threat of violence, a peace that could be shattered at any moment. The story of Arturo Beltrán Leyva is also a story about the culture that has grown around drug trafficking, the so-called narcocultura, that glorifies the lives of drug traffickers, portraying them as glamorous outlaws, as figures of rebellion against a corrupt and indifferent state. This culture is most famously expressed in the narco corrido, a genre of popular music that tells the stories of drug lords, celebrating their exploits, their wealth, and their defiance of the law. Arturo Beltrán Leyva was a frequent subject of these ballads, his life and death immortalized in song. This glorification of the narco lifestyle, while often dismissed as a harmless form of entertainment, has a more insidious effect. It normalizes violence, seduces young people into a life of crime, and makes it harder for society to confront the true horror of the drug war. It creates a moral ambiguity, a blurring of the lines between good and evil, allowing men like Arturo Beltrán Leyva to be viewed not as criminals, but as folk heroes. The challenge for Mexican society is to counter this narrative, to tell a different story, one that exposes the brutal reality of drug trafficking and honors the victims, not the perpetrators of violence. It is a challenge that requires not just a security response, but a cultural one, a battle for the hearts and minds of a generation that has grown up in the shadow of the narco. The legacy of Arturo Beltrán Leyva is a testament to the seductive and destructive power of this culture, a culture he both exploited and embodied. The relationship between Arturo Beltrán Leyva and the United States is complex and often contradictory. On one hand, he was one of the men most wanted by the US government, the leader of an organization responsible for smuggling billions of dollars in cocaine, heroin, and other illicit drugs into the country. The DEA had a massive file on him, and they provided the intelligence and technical support that were instrumental in his eventual demise. On the other hand, there is evidence suggesting that the US government has, at various times, maintained a more ambiguous relationship with certain elements of Mexican drug trafficking. The kingpin strategy, which focuses on eliminating the leaders of the most violent cartels, has often had the unintended consequence of strengthening their rivals. In the case of Arturo Beltrán Leyva, his war with El Chapo Guzmán and the subsequent targeting of the Beltrán Leyva organization by the Mexican and US governments arguably benefited the Sinaloa cartel, which was viewed by some as a more manageable and less violent organization. There have been allegations, most notably from the defense team of Vicente Zambada Niebla, son of Sinaloa cartel leader Ismael El Mayo Zambada, that US federal agents had a secret agreement with the Sinaloa cartel, providing them immunity in exchange for information on their rivals. While these allegations have been denied by the US government, they speak to a long and complicated history of US involvement in the Mexican drug war, a history often shrouded in secrecy and moral ambiguity. The story of Arturo Beltrán Leyva also highlights the role of the United States as the primary consumer of the illicit drugs trafficked through Mexico. The immense profits of drug trafficking are driven by the demand for these drugs on the streets of American cities. This demand fuels the violence in Mexico, corrupts its institutions, and empowers men like Arturo Beltrán Leyva. Any serious attempt to address the problem of organized crime in Mexico must also address the issue of drug consumption in the United States. This means not only a law enforcement approach, but also a public health approach, one focused on prevention, treatment, and harm reduction. The United States also plays a key role in the flow of weapons to Mexican cartels. A significant percentage of the high-power assault rifles and other weapons used by the cartels are purchased legally in the United States and then smuggled across the border. The failure to enact stricter gun control laws in the United States has had a direct and devastating impact on the security situation in Mexico. The life and death of Arturo Beltrán Leyva, therefore, is not just a Mexican story. It is also an American story. A story about the interconnectedness of our two countries, about the shared responsibility we bear for the violence that has plagued our border for so long. It is a story that should force a moment of reflection in the United States, a questioning of policies that for too long have contributed to the cycle of death and destruction in Mexico. The war on drugs is not a war that can be won by building a bigger wall. It is a war that can only be won through cooperation, mutual respect, and a shared commitment to addressing the root causes of the problem on both sides of the border. The scale of the Beltrán Leyva cartel's operations was staggering. At its peak, it was a truly global enterprise, a multi-billion-dollar corporation trafficking in death and addiction. Its core business was trafficking cocaine from South America to the United States. The cartel controlled a sophisticated network of smuggling routes, utilizing a combination of speedboats, submarines, and aircraft to move their product from Colombia and other Andean nations to clandestine airstrips and ports in southern Mexico. From there, the drugs were transported over land, hidden in trucks, cars, and even on the bodies of human mules to the US border. The cartel controlled key smuggling corridors or plazas in cities like Acapulco, Cuernavaca, and Monterrey, often through a combination of bribery and brutal intimidation. But cocaine was not the only product in the cartel's portfolio. It was also a major trafficker of heroin, marijuana, and methamphetamine, a testament to its ability to adapt to changing market demands. The cartel's business model was not limited to drug trafficking. It was a diversified criminal enterprise with involvement in a wide range of illicit activities. Money laundering was a critical component of its operations. The cartel used a complex network of shell companies, currency exchange houses, and international bank accounts to launder their billions of dollars in drug profits, integrating them into the legitimate global financial system. This capacity to launder money on such a massive scale was a testament to the sophistication of their financial operators and the complicity of a global financial system that often turns a blind eye to the origins of dirty money. Kidnapping and extortion were also major sources of revenue for the cartel, particularly in the territories it controlled. Businesses, both large and small, were forced to pay a piso or tax to the cartel in exchange for protection. Those who refused were often kidnapped, and their families forced to pay exorbitant ransoms for their safe return. Many were not so lucky. The cartel also engaged in human trafficking, smuggling migrants from Central and South America into the United States, often subjecting them to horrific abuse and exploitation along the way. The engine of this vast criminal enterprise was violence. The cartel employed an army of sicarios, responsible for enforcing its will, eliminating rivals, and terrorizing the civilian population. These assassins were often former soldiers or police officers, men who had been trained by the state only to sell their skills to the highest bidder. They were equipped with military-grade weaponry, much of it smuggled from the United States, giving them firepower that often outmatched that of the local police. The story of the Beltrán Leyva Cartel is a story about the dark side of globalization. It is a story about how criminal organizations have exploited the very technologies and open borders that have facilitated the growth of the legitimate global economy. It is a story about how the insatiable demand for illicit goods and services in the developed world can have a devastating impact on the developing world. The empire Arturo Beltrán Leyva built was a testament to his own criminal genius, but it was also a reflection of a world in which the lines between legal and illegal, the state and the criminal, have become dangerously blurred. The legacy of Arturo Beltrán Leyva continues to cast a long and bloody shadow over Mexico. While the Beltrán Leyva Cartel as a unified national organization has largely been dismantled, its fragments and successor groups continue to plague many parts of the country. The kingpin strategy that led to Arturo's death, while successful in removing him from the battlefield, has had the unintended consequence of creating a more chaotic and violent criminal landscape. The fragmentation of the cartel, a process known as balkanization, has led to the rise of dozens of smaller, more predatory criminal groups. These groups, often lacking the international drug trafficking connections of their predecessors, have turned to local criminal activities like kidnapping, extortion, and fuel theft to fund their operations. This has brought the violence of the drug war to a more intimate and terrifying level for ordinary citizens. The state of Guerrero, once the heart of the Beltrán Leyva Empire, is a tragic example of this phenomenon. The state is now a patchwork of competing criminal groups, all vying for control of the lucrative opium poppy fields that supply the US heroin market. Violence is endemic, with mass graves, missing students, and murdered journalists becoming a grimly regular feature of the local news. The once glamorous resort city of Acapulco is now one of the most violent cities in the world, a ghost of its former self. The story of Arturo Beltrán Leyva also serves as a warning about the dangers of corruption. His ability to penetrate the highest levels of the Mexican state, to turn public servants into private servants, is a stark reminder of the corrosive effect of drug money on democratic institutions. The Operation Cleanliness scandal, which exposed the extent of his influence within the Federal Attorney General's office, was a national trauma. A moment when the Mexican people were forced to confront the terrifying reality that the enemy was within. While there have been efforts to reform the police and judiciary in the years since Arturo's death, the problem of corruption remains deeply entrenched. The case of the 43 missing students from Ayotzinapa, in which local police, in collusion with a local drug gang, were implicated in the kidnapping and likely murder of the students, is a tragic reminder of how little has changed. The legacy of Arturo Beltrán Leyva is also a legacy of impunity. While many of the leaders of his organization have been killed or captured, the vast majority of the murders, kidnappings, and other crimes committed by the cartel have gone unpunished. This culture of impunity, the sense that one can get away with murder, is one of the greatest obstacles to peace in Mexico. It breeds deep cynicism and mistrust of authorities and creates fertile ground for the next generation of criminals. The ghost of Arturo Beltrán Leyva still haunts Mexico, a reminder of a war that has claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. A war that has left a deep and lasting scar on the nation's soul. The story of Arturo Beltrán Leyva is not just the story of one man. It is the story of a family, a clan that was at the very heart of Mexican drug trafficking for decades. The Beltrán Leyva brothers, Arturo, Carlos, Alfredo, and Héctor, were a formidable force. Their kinship bond gave them a level of trust and loyalty that was rare in the treacherous world of organized crime. But their story is also a tragedy, a tale of how that bond was ultimately shattered by betrayal, violence, and the corrupting influence of power. Arturo was the undisputed leader, the charismatic and ruthless patriarch of the organization. He was the strategist, the negotiator, the public face of the Beltrán Leyva Cartel. His older brother, Carlos, was a lower-profile figure, responsible for managing the cartel's finances and money laundering operations. He was arrested in 2009, just weeks after Arturo's death, a sign of the immense pressure being placed on the family. Alfredo, the youngest brother, known as El Mochomo, was a key logistical operator responsible for overseeing the transport of multi-ton cocaine shipments. His arrest in January 2008 was the catalyst for the bloody war between the Beltrán Leyva Cartel and El Chapo Guzmán, a war that would ultimately lead to Arturo's death and the fragmentation of his empire. Alfredo was extradited to the United States in 2014, where he was sentenced to life in prison. Héctor, the last of the brothers to remain at large, assumed leadership of the cartel after Arturo's death. Known as L.A., he attempted to hold the organization together, but he lacked Arturo's charisma and ability to command respect. He presided over a period of decline and fragmentation as the cartel was battered by internal strife and pressure from authorities. He was arrested in 2014 while eating at a seafood restaurant in the picturesque colonial town of San Miguel de Allende. He died of a heart attack in a Mexican prison in 2018. The story of the Beltrán Leyva brothers is a common one in the world of organized crime. A story of how family businesses built on a foundation of blood and loyalty can be torn apart by the very forces that created them. The immense wealth and power generated by drug trafficking created a climate of paranoia and distrust, a world where one brother could turn against another, and where ties of kinship were no substitute for the cold, hard calculus of power. The fall of the Beltrán Leyva brothers was a major victory for the Mexican government, but it was also a reminder of the dynastic nature of drug trafficking. The surnames may change, the leaders may be killed or captured, but as long as the underlying conditions that allow drug trafficking to flourish remain, there will always be another family, another clan, willing to step in and take their place. The war on drugs is not just a war against individuals. It is a war against a deeply entrenched social and economic system. A system that has proven remarkably resilient in the face of the most sustained and brutal assaults. The tragedy of the Beltrán Leyva family is a testament to the enduring power of that system. In the final analysis, the life and death of Arturo Beltrán Leyva serve as a powerful and disturbing allegory for the modern state of organized crime. He was a transitional figure, a bridge between the old world of traditional family-based drug trafficking and the new world of fragmented, hyper-violent, globally connected criminal enterprises. He was a man who understood the old rules of the game, the importance of family loyalty, but he was also a man willing to break those rules when it suited him. His decision to murder El Chapo Guzman's son was a crossing the Rubicon moment in the history of the Mexican drug war, a signal that the old codes of conduct had been abandoned in favor of a new, more ruthless and nihilistic form of violence. The organization he built was a reflection of his own complex and contradictory nature. It was a sophisticated multinational corporation with a complex division of labor and a global supply chain. But it was also a deeply personal and patrimonial organization, held together by the force of Arturo's own personality and his network of personal relationships. This hybrid nature was both a source of its strength and its ultimate weakness. His charismatic leadership inspired fierce loyalty, but his paranoia and propensity for betrayal created an atmosphere of constant fear and distrust. When he was killed, the organization that had relied so heavily on his leadership crumbled rapidly. The story of Arturo Beltrán Leyva is also a story about the changing nature of violence in the 21st century. He was a pioneer in the use of violence as a tool of psychological warfare, of narco-terrorism. His use of beheadings, of public displays of brutality, of attacks on high-ranking government officials was designed not just to eliminate his enemies, but to terrorize the state and the civilian population, to create a climate of fear and a chaos in which his organization could thrive. This use of performative violence has since become a common tactic among criminal organizations around the world, from the Islamic State to street gangs in Central America. It is a sign of a world in which the lines between crime, terrorism, and insurgency have become increasingly blurred. The state's response to the challenge posed by men like Arturo Beltrán Leyva has also evolved. The operation that led to his death was a model of modern, intelligence-led policing, a joint effort between the Mexican Navy and the USDA that utilized sophisticated surveillance technologies and highly trained special forces. But this militarized response, while effective in eliminating high-value targets, has come at a tremendous cost. It has led to an escalation of violence, widespread human rights abuses, and a blurring of the lines between war and law enforcement. It has also failed to address the underlying social and economic problems that fuel the drug trade. The life of Arturo Beltrán Leyva, therefore, is more than just a crime story. It is a story about the challenges of governance, security, and justice in the 21st century. It is a story that should force us to ask hard questions about the world we have created. A world in which a poor boy from the mountains of Sinaloa can become a global threat. A world in which the line between order and chaos seems to grow thinner every day. The specter of Arturo Beltrán Leyva's reign of terror continues to be a defining element in the narrative of Mexico's struggle against organized crime. His story is not relegated to the past. It is a living history whose consequences are felt every day in the communities that were torn apart by his war. The deeply rooted corruption he cultivated so expertly within government and law enforcement agencies left a legacy of institutional rot that has been incredibly difficult to excise. The Operation Cleanliness scandal was not merely a momentary embarrassment for the Mexican government. It was a profound betrayal of public trust that has had lasting repercussions. Citizens remain deeply skeptical of law enforcement, and this lack of trust hampers efforts to establish community policing and intelligence gathering. When the public believes authorities are just as likely to be working for the cartels as against them, the rule of law becomes a hollow concept. This institutional weakness is one of the main reasons violence has been so persistent in the years since his death. The state's inability to provide basic security and justice has created a vacuum that is filled by criminal actors, perpetuating a cycle of violence and impunity. The economic impact of Arturo's criminal enterprise is another facet of his enduring legacy. The Beltrán Leyva Cartel's diversification into extortion and kidnapping had a devastating effect on the local economies of states like Morelos and Guerrero. Businesses were forced to close, investment dried up, and tourism, a vital source of income, plummeted. The city of Acapulco, once a playground for the international jet set, became a symbol of the country's security crisis. Recovery from this economic devastation has been slow and arduous, and in many areas, the war tax imposed by criminal groups remains a harsh reality of doing business. This economic predation has further entrenched poverty and inequality, making it easier for cartels to recruit young men who see few other viable options for their future. The social fabric of these communities has also been torn. Widespread violence, constant fear, and the normalization of brutality have had a profound psychological impact on a generation of Mexicans. Children have grown up in a world where beheadings and shootouts are part of the daily news cycle, and the trauma of this exposure is incalculable. The glorification of the narco lifestyle, a phenomenon Arturo Beltrán Leyva benefited from and contributed to, has created a deep cultural rift, a crisis of values that pits the allure of easy money and power against traditional values of hard work and community. The story of Arturo Beltrán Leyva, therefore, is not simply the account of a fallen kingpin. It is a stark reminder of the multifaceted and deep-seated nature of the challenge posed by organized crime. It is a challenge that cannot be met with military force alone. It requires a comprehensive approach that addresses the root causes of the problem: corruption, poverty, and a culture of impunity. Until these underlying issues are confronted, the ghost of Arturo Beltrán Leyva and the violent world he helped create will continue to haunt Mexico's future. Reflecting on the epic and bloody saga of Arturo Beltrán Leyva, we are left with a series of profound and unsettling questions. Was his trajectory from a poor boy in rural Sinaloa to a global criminal mastermind inevitable? Or was it the result of a series of choices, both his own and those of societies on both sides of the US-Mexico border? It is a question that challenges us to look beyond simplistic narratives of good versus evil and confront the complex interplay of individual agency and systemic failure. Arturo Beltrán Leyva was not born a monster. He was created, forged in the crucible of poverty, corruption, and a global economic system that created a voracious and insatiable demand for the products he sold. This is not to absolve him of responsibility for the immense suffering he caused, but to recognize that he was a symptom of a much larger disease, a disease that continues to afflict both Mexico and the United States. His story is a mirror, and in it we can see the reflection of our own failures, the failure to create economic opportunities for all, the failure to build a justice system worthy of the name, the failure to address the public health crisis of drug addiction, and the failure to stop the flow of military-grade weapons from the United States into the hands of criminal organizations. The death of Arturo Beltrán Leyva was a moment of apparent victory in the war on drugs, but it was a victory that has rung hollow in the years since. The war has continued, the death toll has continued to rise, and the flow of drugs has not stopped. The kingpin strategy, the idea that this war can be won by cutting off the head of the snake, has proven to be a bloody and futile endeavor. For every kingpin killed or captured, there are a dozen more eager to take his place. So, what is the way forward? The story of Arturo Beltrán Leyva offers no easy answers, but it does offer a clear and urgent warning. The path we are on is a dead end. We must have the courage to imagine a new approach, one not based on militarization and repression, but on a more intelligent and humane understanding of the problem. This means investing in our communities, strengthening our institutions, treating addiction as a disease, and working together as a global community to address the root causes of this global plague. The story of Arturo Beltrán Leyva has ended, but the empire of darkness he helped build continues to cast its shadow. There are other fortunes, other betrayals, and other stories that no one dares to tell. You already know where to find them. Subscribe so that the truth, however brutal it may be, always comes to light.